At Basecamp, there was no written roadmap anywhere, and there was no visual roadmap anywhere. I'm not actually advocating for an implicit roadmap. It's not better. The one thing that I've learned from all the work we've been doing, helping teams of very different sizes and from different organizations apply ShapeUp, is that
welcome to Talking Roadmaps, the channel where we talk about everything road mapping, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Today I'm joined by Ryan Singer. Ryan, introduce yourself.
Hey, Phil, nice to be here. So I wrote a book called ShapeUp, and what's in the book has been a starting point for a lot of people who are kind of tired of the ways they've learned to work, like Scrum and a lot of heavy meetings and a lot of time-consuming rituals and stuff like that. It's also been a starting point for folks who are kind of in an unstructured startup world where there's only like 3 people or 5 people, and they want to figure out kind of as they grow, kind of what is the more repeatable way that they're going to do their product development process and all of that. And what's in the book was born out of my experiences, being in the software industry the last 20 years. I started off doing UI design and interface design, got into programming, kind of became the bridge between those two, eventually into product strategy and into kind of figuring out what are the things we're going to focus on over the next, 6 weeks to quarter, to what are the big kind of things the big mysteries we're going to solve about, how to do this or that in the feature set, over the next year, those kind of things. And I was head of strategy at 37 Signals for about 17 of those years. And a lot of what I learned and went into the book came out of my experiences there.
If you're enjoying the channel, subscribe, hit the bell, and give us a like. And interesting to hear kind of that kind of journey of creating or codifying, I should say, how you guys work and that kind of best practice. I remember trying to do something similar in an organization myself in the days kind of pre-agile, even really being on the radar. It was just like this. We were just really hearing about it, at least on this side of the pond. So it definitely wasn't so much part of the thought process. It was much more waterfall, the kind of mindset that we were kind of using as an organization, but we were trying to codify how this core team of great engineers, we're about 15 of us, was doing and delivering great work. And as we scaled and brought in another 10 to 20 engineers, everything just went wrong.
All the things that you took for granted didn't work anymore. And now how do we define the way that we work in a way that we all kind of know what we're doing, and we have a common language, and we can sort of see what is the input to this step and the output of that step, and how does it also all come together in the time that we intend it to and at the level of quality that we need it to. There's a lot of puzzles to solve there.
Yeah, it was an interesting challenge. I think I even named our approach AIMS. I mean, because it was Accutest was the company name, and it was like Integrated Management System or something like that. But it had that double entendre of this is what we're aiming to do, as well as kind of giving a meaningful name to it. But it's interesting that I see lots of people trying to kind of codify their ways of working to try and find that better way. Because I don't think there's one right way, but there are not good ways, and there's some better ways of doing things.
Well, yeah, and we get into situations where either the team realizes that they're not delivering the way they need to be, and there starts to be some finger pointing, and there's kind of this feeling of like, oh, we have to get out of this situation. We actually can't continue this way. So it can be kind of delivery problems, quality problems, projects dragging. That's one thing that kind of motivates a team where, okay, we actually have to focus on the way that we work. The other thing is where sometimes things are going fine, but what's going fine for 5 people doesn't work when you bring on 10, 15, 20 people. And so you have to be able to formalize the things that were happening intuitively or organically in a way that doesn't kill what was working before, but also allows you to grow. So these are kind of These things happen.
Yeah, and that I do find myself increasingly working with companies in that kind of scale-up space and helping them kind of navigate those challenges. So it's definitely an interesting one. And it's always interesting, I find, how the things you did much earlier in your career start to suddenly come back, and you see yourself repeating it now, helping people find their way through it. I mean, obviously, it's a channel called Talking Roadmaps. We've probably got to bring some roadmaps into this a little bit. So maybe let's start with just a fundamental question. Where do roadmaps factor into the shape-up process, if at all?
I mean, this is a little bit of a there's a misconception there because if you look at what's in the book, I kind of stressed the idea that we don't have what people sometimes call a roadmap, in the sense that we don't have a fixed plan that on this day we will deliver this exact feature, and then on this day we will deliver that feature, and so on. And at Basecamp, where the book was kind of born out of, there was no written roadmap anywhere, and there was no visual roadmap anywhere. There was no kind of thing you could look at that would tell you what the future looked like on the quarter or half year or year long kind of time scale. There was the only thing that was really announced and visible was the very next 6 weeks. But actually, it doesn't mean that there wasn't a roadmap. It's just that there wasn't something that was explicit. And the thing was that if you had a conversation with the partners, there were things that were more important than other things for the next 6 months that were going to get time and effort and attention. And there were certain other things that weren't going to get effort and attention, And so I think that when we talk about what does it mean to have a roadmap, it's the first thing that I can say definitively, because it's so different in everybody's context, is that there's a level of management and planning and work, which we can call the kind of project level. We're in a particular effort and we can see the end of it. We know what work has to be done. So for example, the kind of ideal of that in the shape up world would be, we have a particular, let's say, time box, which is not bigger than 6 weeks. And we've shaped what it is that we're going to do so that we get the outcome that we want to hit. So we've actually figured out what we're going to do to kind of hit that target inside that 6 week time. And we can say kind of very clearly, this is the time and this is the work we're doing. This is what it looks like to be done, But of course, that work has to belong to some kind of a bigger strategy or a bigger understanding of what it is that we're trying to do, And the book talked a lot about this notion of shaping, which is, if we have a given time box, we don't want to just start the project with a very, very rough understanding of some conversations we've had, and now let's jump straight to building. And it also doesn't work if we have just a bunch of detailed drawings and Figma files, telling us where every pixel should go, but we don't actually understand the kind of technical decisions and the architecture underneath it, So a lot of this shaping work is actually about how to get through a particular project successfully. But there's this question of why did we shape this feature or this project for this 6 weeks instead of something else? Why is that the thing that we're working on right now? And we've been teaching in the Shaping in Real Life course. This is something that wasn't really spelled out in the book, because at Basecamp, it happened so kind of invisibly, through conversations, and it wasn't spelled out, like I said. But there's this other work that we call framing. And framing is the definition of the project in terms of, why is this the thing to be doing right now? How do we know when we're done? What is the outcome we're trying to get? What makes this more important than other things? How do we, where does this belong in our strategy? That kind of a thing. So framing is more like the business reason for doing the project. And then shaping is more like the technical solution. So you could think of framing if we're buying a house. Why do we need to buy a house now? Can it wait 2 years or 3 years? Well, the baby is coming, or this and that life changing is happening. And look, sorry, we have to move, even if it's not good timing. But then when it comes to actually choosing the house or designing the house or building the house, there's a million decisions that have to be made. And you can't just show up to the building site with a pile of wood and some hammer and nails and then think you're going to start building a house. You do have to have a kind of architecture or plan, So the shaping is the technical approach to doing that project. The framing is a kind of business motivation for doing that project. Why are we doing this, and what are we going to get out of it, and what makes it the thing to do now? The place where this kind of connects to the topic of roadmaps is that there needs to be some kind of, well, actually, there doesn't have to be. We can be in a situation where maybe we are so free and relaxed that we can just frame one thing, shape it, do it, frame the next thing, shape it, and do it. But we find ourselves in different situations where that's not enough, and we need to have a longer time frame agreement or conversation or coordination, and there's very many, actually, surprisingly, it's interesting. There's very different reasons why we might find ourselves kind of forced into a quarterly planning conversation. Of course, there's the kind that is led by having investors or people who are funding you, and they want to have some kind of answers from you about what you're going to be spending your time on, right? Over the longer chunk, over the next quarter or half. There's also situations where you might be, for example, a bootstrapped company. You don't have investors who are pressuring you to hit any target or give them an explanation about what you're doing. But you realize that quarter after quarter has gone by, and that ambitious feature that you've talked about doing, or that new product that you've talked about doing, it keeps not happening. And you realize if we're ever going to actually do this thing, we actually need to make different decisions about how we spend our time over the next quarter. If we want to end, let's say it's the beginning of 2024, and we realize, like, man, we really need to have a prototype of this feature that we've been talking about before by summer. We need to have this thing live. Like, we're not going to let another year go by. So then you look at the year, and you have to actually kind of then work backward of, well, what are the other commitments we have? What are the things that we kind of know that we have to do? And how does the puzzle fit together so that we end up with that big thing actually happening in the amount of time that we need it to happen in, So this is where, when we move up to this level of conversation about what's important at the level of the quarter or the half year or so on the one side, it's a coordination problem. It's a puzzle piece problem. What capacity, what availability, kind of what can we do with who is available when. But it's also very much a strategy conversation. Why is this important? How do we align on doing this instead of that? So I tried to put a few things on the table so that you can kind of lead us where you want to go, because these are quite different directions of conversation, right? The strategy aspect of this versus the puzzle piece aspect, and also how this relates at the high altitude of the quarter strategy down to what are we actually framing and shaping to actually go execute, in the next 2 weeks or 4 weeks or 6 weeks or what have you.
It's super interesting. Like, just thinking of that implicit roadmap as opposed to explicit roadmap. And that the biggest challenge I find there is making sure that everyone's on the same page. Like, something explicit is easier to align everyone around. So maybe let's start there in terms of what challenges you've experienced or how you've overcome those challenges of making sure everyone's aligned. You said it just kind of happened.
Well, there were a lot of structural factors at Basecamp that made that work. The thing is, I'm not actually advocating for an implicit roadmap. It's not better. The one thing that I've learned from all the work we've been doing, helping teams of very different sizes and from different organizations apply ShapeUp, is that there's so many details of how you do things that depend on the structure of your organization. When it comes to shaping projects, the kind of thing that we identified as the constant that's always true is, if you need to deliver something by a certain date, then you can't jump into it not knowing what it is, And so we have to figure out how to make this shaping step happen and this framing step happen so we can more clearly get that alignment and define what it is that we need to do so that we hit that deadline. And then we have a suite of methods and things that we teach to do that, following the principles from the book, but also kind of more concretely, how do we actually hold a shaping session? What do these different steps of work look like? What I'm learning, I wasn't even interested in roadmaps or long-term planning for the first couple of years of doing this. I didn't even realize it was relevant. But then, the same questions started to come up. So, like, for example, question came up, how do we do this with a new product? You can't build a whole new product, in a single cycle. You can't do a whole product in 4 weeks or 6 weeks, right? And that's kind of the unit that we shape at, right? So This is an example where I've been in this situation before. I was working on a side project, no formal organization really. It's like 3 people working together, and we didn't have a formal road mapping process, but all of a sudden we were agreeing, okay, we are agreeing that we're going to invest our time part-time for probably a year to get this new product built. And we weren't just going to pretend like we didn't need to use this time intelligently and just start on the one thing and then see how it goes. We needed to have some kind of an understanding, So even without thinking that I was doing road mapping, we naturally started having conversations once a quarter about what are the things that we have to accomplish this quarter, right? And what I noticed was that it was not very different from what we do when we do shaping sessions. In the shaping session, we say, if we're going to have, let's say, 4 weeks of capacity to build something, and this is the outcome we need, then we are figuring out, well, what are the pieces that are going to go together that add up to something that's meaningful inside of that, let's say, 4-week appetite that we have. If we're looking at it on the standpoint of a quarter, it's not really different. It's what we're doing then is we're not shaping the technical approach of here is how this screen is going to connect to that screen, or we're going to call this API or whatever in the context of a project. When we're at this quarterly level, what we're actually doing is shaping what the projects might be, So this is a little bit more like, for example, we were working on we were building this product which does a specific kind of technical analysis on a demand side interviews. It takes the outputs of a specific interview method into the app, and then it puts them into a kind of, actually it's not so different in principle from how an embedding works in a machine learning or an AI context. It kind of puts all these things into an embedding so you can do clusters, and then you can kind of get the 3 main groups of the jobs to be done of the customers you interviewed, so that you can then take that into your product strategy. So we wanted to build this tool, and there's a lot of moving parts. There's some mathy stuff. There's kind of an algorithm that has to work. There's a bunch of UI steps that I had never seen done before, that where we needed to innovate. There was going to be a lot of polishing work to make this look like a real product and not just a rough, researchy prototype thing. There was so much work that had to happen. So one of the things that we did first was we said, okay, what are the biggest unknowns that we have to solve to know that we are even going down the right approach and this is going to be viable, right? So what can we do if we have a year where we're going to invest in this product? What are we going to do in this first quarter that is going to help us to actually eliminate the biggest unknowns and get to something that kind of hangs together? The first quarter means more or less not more than really 2 or 3 major things getting built out, And so what we ended up doing was we kind of framed what the outcome would be if we had a very rough version of the thing that allowed you to input the interview data. If we had a very, very rough, something we would never ship, but just something that would allow us to do this thing that we called affinitizing. And we knew that we didn't even want to design the experience for it. It was just that we needed the data of this step. So it's like, we're going to see if we can do a decent interview input experience. We need the affinitizing data, but we don't care about the experience at all. But then we're going to have to do this clustering algorithm, and we need to make sure that we can run the affinitized groups through the clustering algorithm. And if the clustering algorithm, if you can just pull the crank and it gives you an answer in the console, that's a success. And if we get these 3 things kind of plugged together and the machine works, that'll be a great starting point for Q2.
Yeah. I mean, so it sounds to me like the highest risk you had there was very much at the feasibility level. And what I'm hearing is you're taking the biggest risks first, which is always what I advocate. But so often people start at the opposite end with the small risks. It's like, let's get some progress.
Well, it's easy to want to feel the progress of doing the things you already know how to do, right? But that's not the progress that the project needs, because, if we want to be reinvesting in Q2 consciously, because we eliminated all of those things that might have killed the project in Q1, right? Or where we would have needed to go down a very different path.
Yeah, or where you might have had to kill it in Q4 because you didn't address them early, and all that earlier work is wasted.
That's what we don't want. Exactly. So that's one example of, of kind of road mapping, aside from the formality of road mapping, but responding to the reality of, we needed to have a strategy of how we were going to spend our time and what kind of outcomes we needed to reach, and it didn't mean that we made promises about specific features. It was more like, these are the kind of, these aspects of functionality need to hang together. Another big part of this was that we defined what was out. So this doesn't need to be polished from a, it looks pretty perspective at all. And not only that, but the second of the two areas that I mentioned, the affinitizing, doesn't even need to be the actual real user interface. We just need to get the data from A to B so that we can try out the clustering, So this was we were very explicit about what was in and what was out. Another version of this is something I saw my friends at Autobooks doing. They're also very good at having this this organic approach to the roadmap, where it's very much based on kind of what's actually driving us to talk about planning at this level. And they would have a quarter coming where they would start to talk about, well, we don't actually know what in particular we're going to say yes to, in terms of potential projects or whatever for the next quarter. We don't know what exact feature modifications or growth-oriented changes we're going to make. We don't know what those things are. But they would say, what we do know is that for what's happening in the wider context of the business, in this quarter, we are going to say yes to things that improve activation. And we're going to say no to things that are anything else. Right? Because we're in this kind of bigger strategic context. So that's something different. Whereas the example I gave about building the new product was a little bit more like we were kind of sequencing the functionality that we needed to create. This was more of like a filter on the kind of ideas that could come up over the quarter. And it was a kind of, you could almost call it wasn't a plan. It was more like guidance, So that was a situation where they, instead of being 3 people working on a little side project, it was an organization with a bunch of product managers and quite a few people. And they're saying, look, all the different PMs can come to us with different ideas throughout the quarter for, something we can do in 1 week, in 2 weeks, maybe in 3 weeks, then in 1 week again, very targeted improvements, but they should be about activation here, right? And then in the next quarter, it was totally different. It wasn't about activation anymore. It was about how do we make our process of doing integrations with our partners faster. There's a certain kind of integration work that has to happen, and we need to figure out how can we do that with less of a time investment and less back and forth. So that's a very different kind of investment in different kinds of work, but people can identify what progress would mean and what it means to actually move forward on that kind of a thing, in this bigger time frame.
Well, I would hope that visibility of what was changing in the next quarter was a little bit known in advance as well, because, like you said, some things take longer. Now, time chunking in 6 weeks is great. I've worked on things that were going to take 18 months to deliver. We knew that from day one, and we can time chunk and kind of see your earlier deliverables and get the benefits of it. But we knew that really we couldn't deliver the value to our customers in any real terms, in anything other than like an early access program for quite a long time. But if the goalposts moved like that would make it quite hard. Whereas in a more mature product, I can absolutely see that change of objective. It's usually aligned with the OKR cycle of, right, we're going after activation. And that to me is the essence of strategy. It's like, this is what we're saying yes to. These are the filters, the guidelines, or the guardrails for everyone to be able to make the right decisions, to bring me the right things to say yes to, instead of bring me a ton of the wrong things.
Yeah, there's a lot of contrast there. The situation you described with the kind of 18-month project, that's like the new product development I was talking about. We couldn't just say, bring me things to say yes to. We actually needed to have a kind of bigger picture understanding of what the architecture was of the thing that we were trying to pursue. It has to do this, and this, and those things all have to come together to produce the value to the point where we can give this to somebody else to go use, versus the situation of strategically, we're focusing more on activation versus bringing more leads in versus making our integration more efficient or whatever. Those are things which are they're a little bit more like categories as opposed to like a sequence of functions that all have to add up to some kind of bigger, Voltron.
Yeah, I mean, one of the startups I was working with last year, they're building an ERP in a specific segment, and they were struggling with, well, when is it enough that it delivers enough value for our clients to actually use this thing? Because one module on its own didn't feel enough. Like there was enough value there because the clients kind of needed the whole thing to be able to do their job, which felt like something very large and a very large investment that they were hoping to get out to market faster. It was an interesting challenge trying to bridge and find that sweet spot of big enough and valuable enough.
This is where, this question of kind of when can we get to a point where we've done something that matters? When have we gotten to a point where we've done something valuable? It helps, I've found, to flip between two very different ways of looking at the whole business. There's the supply side, which is the question of, well, what are we going to make? Right? And how are we structured? And like, what do we do? And there's the demand side, which is what's going on in the world where anybody cares. And this split between kind of shaping what to do versus framing the problem and opportunity falls into it's that same division. The shaping is the supply side of what to go do, and the framing is identifying what's going on in the demand side that means that somebody is going to care. And sometimes the demand comes to us in a very, very fuzzy form, that like everybody says the customers we need to have, for example, I worked on a project last year, and the start of the project was some stakeholders saying, we need notifications. We need a mobile app with notifications, right? And it's like, okay, if you need notifications, let's just kind of unpack what that means. And like, nobody could see any way that we were going to build that with the capacity they had on the engineering side. It was going to be like a 2-year project to kind of build this whole thing out, and to get everyone aligned and to do that. And my first instinct in that situation was to say, like, this doesn't feel kind of crispy enough. It doesn't feel small and concrete enough that I can really get my hands around why the status quo isn't good enough and how a notification is going to make a difference. So in this case, we, rather than kind of doing one approach, is we could say, this is a legitimate approach. If you had the time and the people, you could say, well, they say they want notifications and their requirements are a little complicated in what they gave us, but we are just going to be the heroes who do it. So we are going to pull out our Gantt chart and we are going to make the giant plan that builds the giant thing, and we'll see you in 2 years. That's a legitimate supply side approach. And there might be cases where that makes sense, especially in a situation where we are time constrained, when we are resource constrained, and we need to kind of show progress in smaller units. It helps to do more work on the demand side. So what work on the demand side means, okay, so I'm hearing that you want notifications, and I'm sure you're right. Can you tell me, if you don't have notifications in the next 3 months, 6 months, what starts to break? This is a question about their world, not about what to build. Another question, for example, is you've been talking about needing notifications for 2 years. There's been a lot of other stuff that keeps kind of winning in terms of what you spend time on. And there's this feeling like, okay, we really finally have to build out this notifications infrastructure. What happened? What's going on that made now the time? Why are you choosing this over other things, right? So what is this competing with? When we dug into this, what we actually found out was that the organization had a 20-year-old email mailing list. And this mailing list had tens of thousands of people on it that who knew if they should even be on this list anymore. And you know what I mean? Like it was just this ancient system. And when they said notifications, it turned out their concern was like, we can't keep sending our strategic updates on this mailing list when we don't even know who gets it anymore, and we don't have control over filtering it. And like, we can't keep, like, the board isn't comfortable sending stuff out on this list. So like, what they really needed was a way to send announcements that went through their SSO system that tied into their kind of permission infrastructure, so they knew who was who, and it was kind of going through that other system, and it wasn't just the raw mailing list. So when we actually did the work on the demand side to really detail what the context was, what was breaking, what was going wrong, why the urgency was there, and we identified a nearer outcome, which is we're going to be able to send a blast out and not worry about who's getting it and if it's going to the right people or not. Then all of a sudden, the shaping work, the supply side work of how we're going to execute that was like, and we built a 6-week project that gave them it still sent emails. It was a mailing list alternative, but it plugged into their SSO infrastructure so that it was using the identity system they had and everything like that. And it totally made this pain go away. And then what was also interesting was that even though that was kind of the end of the promise, the end of the commitment, the end of the plan, this kind of 6-week effort, it turned out that it also gave them better footing for doing the mobile apps and the notifications and stuff, that the push notifications that they wanted to do. So I think this is a really key thing, is that when we start talking about long-term planning and road mapping and so on, it so easily falls on the supply side of, well, we just need to have a higher resolution picture of who is doing what when, and then we're going to get through the project, And unless your project and your team meet very, very specific structural requirements, that kind of almost like a construction plan is usually not going to work out. And there's much bigger gains to be had by flipping over to the demand side.
So I'm going to bring us a little bit back, because you've used the term shaping and framing a bit, and the framing sounds very much like the vision, the strategy, the objective sort of side of things. And so maybe you can just kind of unpack a little bit more of the sort of content you'd have there and how that kind of might link into a roadmap in the loosest sense of the word.
Yeah, that's interesting. So this is actually an area where I haven't yet formalized it, So this is a little bit like the bleeding edge in terms of, because the what's in the book Shape Up and what we teach in Shaping in Real Life, the course that we teach now, is it's 20 years of iterating and formalizing, and testing across a lot of different companies inside the boundaries of projects. And what we are now in is kind of the early phase of formalizing this, how this connects up to the level of the quarterly planning and the half year and so on. So this is actually a super new area, and so I don't have a speech for you yet on this. What I can tell you that's really interesting is that what we're seeing is that there's a lot of similarities. It's that the quarterly planning is very much like framing a project, except the puzzle pieces that we then have to shape inside of that frame. So you can think about a frame as like, if we're going to work on this thing for 4 weeks, let's say, like, how do we know that we did the right thing, right? What was the problem we were solving? What's the outcome? What are the metrics? If we can frame that work and we say, if these things happen, then the problem is gone. You can think of it just very simply as an acceptance test. Just imagine just writing an acceptance test for the project, right? So that's a frame. If we zoom out to the level of a quarter, what we're looking then is, what's the acceptance test for all the projects that are going to get happened in that quarter, right? So for example, we just had a kind of a very informal, my wife Katya and I worked together on designing and building this Shaping in Real Life course. And we had you see, it just happens naturally again, like the talk around New Year's, of like what's coming up in the beginning of the year. And we identified like, you know what? We really want to do those iterations on the course that we were talking about doing for the last 6 months. Like we really want to do those and we don't want to let this slide anymore. So then we thought, okay, if in the first quarter, we are really going to make progress on doing these iterations to the course material, what does that actually mean? We have to set up the filming studio again so that we can record new lessons and revisions to the lessons. We have to pull together all those different things that we've talked about changing and kind of actually identify what are the most important ones that we need to change, right? Out of the million iterations to the course we could make, what are the 2 or 3 things that we actually would do first, right? And we realized that, we don't actually know how to answer that question. We don't know which changes are the most important and relevant for people. We need to do that interview project we've been talking about doing. So we basically framed the first quarter as we are going to get the studio set up so that we can do another round of filming and changes and updates. We are going to get a new interview project going with people who've already done the course, but with a different focus than on past interview projects. So we're going to learn kind of where the course wasn't working for people and what it clearer about the very specific ways that they measure progress when they come out of the course, so that we can say which of all these different things are actually going to make the biggest difference, to the results that people are getting when they do the course. So we kind of figured out, okay, we're going to do these interviews. We have to do the studio setup. And there were a couple other things. And then you look at the quarter and you realize like, okay, if I'm going to do interviews, I need lead time to recruit people and blah, 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 right? If we're going to do the studio setup, then I can't be doing the interviews at the same time because blah, blah, blah. And then already we kind of started to get to kind of a rough picture of like, these are the things that are important, So this is an example of the broad framing of like what's most important for this quarter is we need to iterate more on the course. We don't want to continue to have the same lessons as before, right? And then we identified kind of the big chunks of work that we're going to make progress on in order to get there. And then, January 1st, 2nd, 3rd, they came and we kind of started working on the first thing on this studio setup. And then it was maybe, 3 weeks into January. And of course, I started to realize like, oh man, if we're going to make these interviews happen, I have to actually figure out where this is going to belong on the calendar. So this moment came of, it's not enough to have the strategic conversation. We had that. It's not enough to kind of shape a little bit of what these projects are going to be inside of that for the quarter. I actually need to get a little bit down into the details of like, okay, when am I traveling and not traveling? And like, when can we actually put this unbroken time of the 2 weeks to do the interview analysis and so on, right? So
I'm going to change tack a little bit, I think, Ryan. Let's go here. Yeah. What do you believe is best practice when it comes to road mapping?
If we try to make a lot of promises about different projects that we're going to build, like if we're going to say that, I'm sure you already know this and your audience already knows this. If we make a lot of promises that we're going to build, these are the top 5 feature requests that customers had, and we're going to build them all. And at the end of at the end of this much time, all these features are going to ship, or our customers keep asking us for all these things. And so we're going to promise our customers that these are the things that we're going to build next because it's what you asked for. Or, we're trying to tell people that we're going to build these things because it's coming up in sales conversations, you know? The problem with those is that you're batching together a bunch of unrelated work, you know? And you might find that when you're in the middle of one piece of that work that you sketched out, you discover the thing that is 10x more important than all those other things that you wrote, you know? And so it's much more, if there is a best practice here, it's more important to understand your strategy for the next quarter than it is to make commitments to specific projects. Because at the end of the day, the specifics of what you're working on might get thrown out the window for a lot of different reasons. If you keep making adjustments in the pursuit of a consistent strategy for that quarter, of this is the thing that's important, you know, then you won't reach the end of the quarter and then think we wasted our time and we didn't get anywhere, you know. Versus if you make a lot of promises to the specifics of projects and then the projects start to get hairy, then what can happen is 6 months can go by and you were just digging and dragging in the same piece of work and you weren't actually delivering the value that strategically is needed either to the business stakeholders or, you know, in terms of the demand of the customer, you know. So giving oneself that optionality, I think, is the number one most important thing. But optionality without framing is just chaos. You know what I mean? So, you know, if there is a best practice here, it's having the quarterly conversation, which is less about the projects and more about what needs to change in terms of strategically, what needs to change. You know, are we still pursuing fit and we haven't found it yet? Do we have fit, but we're having issues with conversion and activation and stuff like that? Like, is there an unknown, a research area that we want to really have an answer to that we never had time to before? Is there a new product that we want to start understanding? If we want to build a new product later this year, do we need to have certain inputs that are going to allow us to do that, like certain kinds of user research or prototyping? You know, like these bigger conversations about what we're trying to accomplish this year are really the important things.
Let's flip it the other way around, though. What's the biggest mistakes you've seen happening?
I would say two. One is what I mentioned of making a lot of very specific commitments to specific projects, that these are the 10 features that we're going to ship them all by this date, you know. The other one is too often the road mapping happens as a kind of bullet list. You know, we're going to do this and this and this and this and this. And the problem with bullets is they don't compete for resources. So when we're in a shaping session for a specific project, we can have a concept of like, we're going to use this library and we're going to use that API and then we're going to show this on that screen. But we have to, before we say that we're done, we have to actually add up the work and say, can we do these 10 things inside of 4 weeks or not? Right? And the same thing is true on road mapping. To actually know if this is a realistic plan, we've got to put it out of the bullet points and translate it into time boxes, right? What would it look like if we gave each one of those things that we said we're going to do a time box? And can we, even in a very rough way, put the puzzle together in a way that seems believable, right? And simply moving from bullet points to time boxes and sliding those back and forth, even inside of Miro or something like that, you know, is usually an eye-opening moment. You know what I mean? That like, okay, maybe this doesn't all fit in the first quarter. And then this is a wonderful moment then to say, because it doesn't all fit, it means that we have to have a crispier conversation about what is important for us in this period of time.
I think one of our earlier guests, Simon Whitkiss, said something very similar along the lines of, it's got to be grounded in reality. There's no point in committing or making plans of things that you just have no chance of doing. If you had to distill your philosophy on road mapping down to 1 or 2 sentences, what would it be?
Wrestle with what is truly possible and leave latitude for unknowns.
And I love the thoughtfulness there as I watched you thinking. Some people choose to ramble and then get to the clarity. Other people choose to pause and get to the clarity, as you did. It's always interesting to see how people's process works. And I have to do my Steve Blankism at the end here. Is there anything I should have asked you about road mapping that I haven't?
A lot of the road mapping conversation, it easily goes to this place of like, what is our strategy and what should we be doing and so on. The reality for a lot of people who create a roadmap in this world is that they are not the ones actually in the strategy seat. They're not the ones who are deciding anything, but they actually have to get through a kind of moment with a superior where they have to demonstrate that they know what they're doing. So there's a very big difference between we need to define a strategy for Q3 versus being pulled into a meeting and saying, do you have your act together so that you can execute by the end of Q3? And the roadmap is very much, I've actually done some research on this. The roadmap is, as an artifact, is very much hired for the latter case, not the former. The strategy conversation is more the bullet points and the executive horse trading. The roadmaps, when we talk about people building this thing that looks like a timeline with boxes and stuff, this is actually someone who is in a management role, project manager or product manager, who is trying to resolve a whole bunch of conflicting constraints and put a complicated world into order so that they can say, yes, either so that they can say, yes, I'm on top of it. Look, I have an answer to everything. Or so that they can manage the scheduling and the capacity nightmare of figuring out how to catch all the people at the right time so that the work actually gets done.
Love it. And I believe it can be used for both of those purposes, but I think you're right. It is predominantly used for those second ones. And I think that mismatch of, dare I say, the two jobs to be done of a roadmap is part of the challenge of why it's often misunderstood that some people are expecting one and others are expecting the other.
Yeah, a big mismatch is that a lot of folks who are in the PM role talk about strategy, but their work isn't strategy. And it would be very helpful that we start to untangle these things and say, if you are in an executive role and you're setting strategy, let's talk about setting strategy. If you're a PM and you're actually responsible for delivery, let's talk about how to get better at delivery, right? And if you can get better at delivery and you can start to actually have a few hours in your week where you could think, now we can start to introduce some strategy, right? But to really deal with these things, in a more frank way, kind of to how they really are, rather than having a lot of like la 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 conversation about strategy that doesn't get put into practice because there's just too much puzzle piecing and horse trading and stuff that's taking up the time.
I mean, one of my theories is product managers, just as product managers, if we go back 15, 20 years, we're truly doing that strategy work. But the role is kind of what used to be a product manager is almost a director of or plus of products these days. And there's a whole new operational layer with that more delivery-centric focus that I'm not saying it's a bad thing. It's a change to the role, but some people are still using the term to refer to the job it used to be.
Yeah, that's a very good point. You know, we are actually just simply in a new context. The number of engineers who are out there working as employees in software, building software, I mean, we've never had that before. It's exploded in the last 10 years, you know? And of course, you cannot just hire 1 million people without starting to improvise, let's say, a coordination layer, you know? So I think a lot of this is that we are very new in the current context of like, how do we actually do coordination and how do we actually figure out what it is that we are asking all of these technical people to do.
Maybe a conversation for picking up another time. Ryan, it's been absolutely awesome having you here today. I always like to finish with giving you an opportunity to pitch yourself, how people can get in touch, how they can find you, and how you can help them. Fire away.
If anyone's curious about ShapeUp, there's a short video called Shaping in a Nutshell on YouTube that gives you kind of the 17-minute introduction to some of the ideas. My website is feltpresence.com. And if you want to figure out kind of how to actually do this stuff with the team that you have and the time pressures you have, then our course Shaping in Real Life is a really good way to get clarity on what this looks like end to end and pull out some specific skills you can learn and things that you can start to apply.
Awesome. We'll make sure some of those links are down below for people to find them as well. Ryan, it's been great having you here today. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Cheers.